give a warm Rancho Mirage welcome to Charlie Lovett.
Thanks. Thank you. So, in spite of this thing on my face, I'm not going to be showing off my Backstreet Boys moves. I'm just going to warn you about that right now because I know that's what everybody was hoping for. So I'm happy to talk about any of my books, but I'm especially today going to talk about the most recent one, The Lost Book of the Grail, which is a challenge for me because it's not an easy book to talk about simply because it is a book that's very much about secrets and filled with secrets, and I don't want to tell you what any of those secrets are because you're going to start to learn them later on this afternoon, and then when you're cursing me at 3 o'clock in the morning because you can't put it down. And but I can talk about a little bit about where some of them come from. And so I see this talk as ideal for any of those of you like myself who are a little bit ADD. I'll be flitting from topic to topic. And on the screen here you see just a few of the things that sort of came into play in my putting this this book together. Now I'm going to put this back up at the end, and here's the good news for you. When it comes time for the first question, it's going to be so easy for you. All you have to do is point at something on the screen. I actually had a 6-month-old baby ask the first question at one of my events. I used to go to the Lewis Carroll Society meetings in London, and they had this brilliant idea. They actually had a member of their society whose designated role was the asker of the first question. I encourage everyone to get one of those. So before I go into the text of the book, I want to talk a little bit about that page on the book that, oh, let's see, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. Okay. You know that page on the book that you never pay any attention to, that you flip right past at the very beginning, is usually a Shakespeare quote from some play you vaguely remember reading in high school? Well, that's a page that I give a lot of thought to. And the epigram on this book is from a gentleman named Major Ronald Balfour. Now, Major Balfour happens to be the uncle of a very dear friend of mine, but he also happens to be one of only 2 monuments men. These were the men who worked to save works of art in the late stages of World War II. He was one of only 2 of them who was actually killed in action. And he had written a speech which he never had a chance to deliver, in which he said this: "No age lives entirely alone. Every civilization is formed not merely by its own achievements, but by what it has inherited from the past. If these things are destroyed, we have lost a part of our past, and we shall be the poorer for it." And my books, if you've ever read any of them, this might sound familiar to you, are very much about, among other things, the way we pass our culture and our stories and our heritage from generation to generation. And specifically when that way involves this thing called books. I almost always have some sort of book in my narrative that I treat almost the same way you would treat as a character, and in this book, there's no exception to that. So let me tell you a little bit about how the book is put together, and then I'll introduce you to some of the characters. The book, the subtitle of this book is A Visitor's Guide to Barchester Cathedral. The book is set largely in the library of an English cathedral in a town called Barchester. I'm curious, has anybody here ever been to Barchester? I just always ask this, because I'm always hoping somebody will raise their hand, because unfortunately it is a fictional city. Obviously a very well-educated crowd here tonight. I should have just planted somebody to raise a hand. So there's a modern story about a character who I'll introduce to you in a few minutes, who is involved in trying to uncover a mystery about the history of the cathedral, but who also believes very strongly from lessons that his grandfather taught him when he was a boy, that the history of that cathedral is somehow entangled with the history of the legends of the Holy Grail. He doesn't quite know how, but he thinks there's some sort of connection. So every chapter begins with this, and if you're a film producer, I can tell you how to make this work as a Netflix series, by the way. I was in LA the other day, nobody bit. So every chapter starts out with about a 3 or 4 page scene from the history of the cathedral or the city of Barchester, starting in about 560 AD and working its way forward to the present. And so the first scene that I would like to read to you is actually the first scene in the book. It's an excerpt from that, but it's the most recent of those historical scenes. After we have this scene, we kind of go back to the earlier scenes. This scene takes place on the 7th of February, 1941. I wasn't always that specific, but in this case, I was quite specific. It is, if you will cast your minds back to the 7th of February 1941, right in the middle of the Blitz. And unexpectedly, there's been a Nazi bombing raid on the town of Barchester, which has no strategic value, but nonetheless, these things happen. And a young choir boy named Edward has been enlisted to help remove all the valuable books and manuscripts from the cathedral's library. There we go. Edward reached up and took hold of a vellum-bound manuscript on the shelf in front of him. He was turning to go when the book jerked out of his hands. He reached out to keep it from falling to the floor, only to find the ancient tome floating in midair. It must be a magic book, he thought, watching transfixed as it swayed in front of him, its pages illuminated by the orange light. Each word on each page, he saw, was the same length, and Edward was just thinking that perhaps all magical incantations came in words of exactly 9 letters, when a desperate voice rang out next to him. How do we get them loose? Edward realized that the volume he had been holding was not hovering in the air through some enchantment, but hanging from a chain that connected it to the shelf. Each of the manuscripts in the case before him, he saw, was similarly chained. There's no time, said Mr. Grantley. Tear off the covers. The man next to Edward grabbed the chain of the dangling manuscript in one hand and the book in the other. With a loud grunt, he rent the two apart, leaving the manuscript's front cover hanging by its chain. He thrust the volume at Edward, who clasped it to his chest and ran for the exit. Mr. Grantley had already begun a pile of books on the far side of the cloister, but the volume Edward held seemed too important to merely cast onto the heap. He crept into the darkest corner of the cloister and laid the book in a niche in the stone wall. He stood breathing heavily for a few seconds, then dashed back to the library. A line had formed from the shelves down the stairs and into the cloister. Edward found himself at the top of the stairs, passing volume after volume to a pair of arms that reached out from the shadows. Every few minutes, another window broke from the heat of the fire. After more than an hour, he heard Mr. Grantley's voice shouting, "Get out! Get out! The fire's here!" Edward looked up to see flames shooting through the windows and licking the tops of the now empty bookcases that lined the far wall. In another second, he felt himself pressed along by the line of people and almost carried down the stairs. Edward stood for a minute, gulping in the cool night air, then suddenly remembered the manuscript. He ran to the corner of the cloister where he had secreted it, but a man in a strange gray clerical robe was lifting the book from its hiding place. Edward followed him out of the cloister and saw him slipping through the crowd toward St. Martin's Lane. "A good night's work, Edward," said Mr. Grantley, clapping a hand on Edward's shoulder. "But we better get you home." They turned toward Edward's house, and as they walked away from the crowd, the boy glanced back toward the arch that led into St. Martin's Lane, but the strange figure was gone. And of course, gone with him is the manuscript. The original working title of this novel was The Lost Manuscript, and that's the manuscript that gets lost. And it's part of what Arthur, our hero, is trying to find, because it's the manuscript that tells the story of the saint who founded the original monastery on which became Barchester Cathedral, St. Ewolda. Now this scene, I told you it was on a specific date, and it was also inspired by a specific date, the 14th of November, 1940, which was the date, or 1941, the date of the Coventry Blitz. Coventry was the only city that lost its medieval cathedral in England during World War II. There were others that were damaged. I was amazed when we were in Canterbury after this book had been written, and we were taking a tour around the town, and our tour guide said the only part of the cathedral that was damaged by the bombing was the library. And so the idea that you needed to save these things out of the library is not so far-fetched. But nonetheless, the bombing of Coventry did destroy the cathedral. A very modern cathedral's been built next to it now. And the next day, there was a statement from the Ministry of Home Security who said, "The people of Coventry bore the ordeal with great courage." Now, if you're writing a historical novel, which I'm sure most of you probably are, you or I at least, you look for these little nuggets where you can sort of sum up an entire time period in a single sentence. And to me, this sentence, simple though it may be, really sums up what life was like on the home front in Britain during World War II. And so, being a good author, I decided I needed to plagiarize it. And so if you look in the fictional Barchester newspaper, you will find a sentence that says, "The people of Barchester have borne their ordeal with bravery." You change these things just enough to get away with it. So this is the night when this manuscript that goes missing, this manuscript that I sort of treat as almost as a character. And when characters become interesting in narration is when they encounter obstacles or conflict. And to move this manuscript or the story that it represents and the secrets that it represents through 1,500 years of British history gives one the opportunity for lots of nice, juicy conflict and difficulties. So we begin in the Saxon period when things are somewhat calm until we have the invasion of the Vikings, which begins in the late 8th century. 793 AD is the first Viking invasion, which took place on the island of Lindisfarne, where the monks, ironically, had built their monastery on an island, thinking that would be a good way to protect it from being destroyed, not knowing that the danger would come not from the land, but from the sea. So I decided in referencing the Viking attacks that I would have a monk from Lindisfarne write a letter to a monk at Barchester warning him about these attacks. And so I just decided to filch the words of Simeon of Durham, the great 9th century historian, because there were no copyright laws in the 9th century, so I can just use his words. I don't have to change them at all. But it's rather horrifying what he writes. He writes, "They came from the sea and attacked like stinging hornets, like ravening wolves. They made raids on all sides, slaying not only cattle, but priests and monks. They came to the holy church at Lindisfarne and laid all to waste, trampled the holy places with polluted feet, dug down the altars, and bore away the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried away captive, some they drove out naked after mocking and vexing them, some they drowned in the sea." And yet, in spite of that attack and others like it, the great book of Lindisfarne, the Lindisfarne Gospels, survived. And so again, the idea that a book, even before the days of printing, when there was only one copy of each book, could move through great spans of history and could survive is based very much on reality. And if you go to the British Library today, you can see the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's one of the great examples of early medieval illuminated manuscript in the world. So the Vikings eventually got driven out and things calmed down in Barchester for a while until the Normans showed up. Now, I never quite understood how the Normans could so easily invade and take over Britain until I found this picture and realized that the Brits were only being protected by these skinny little embroidered men. And so clearly it wasn't too tough for the French to take over. But the Norman invasion, in all seriousness, was more of a cultural invasion. The military bit was over right away. The cultural bit is still going on. I think you could probably make a reasonable argument that Brexit is a reaction against the Norman invasion. But all of a sudden, if you were living in a monastery, suddenly your bishop was no longer Saxon. He was French. You were speaking a different language. The language of the services, of course, was Latin, but the language that you were speaking outside the church moved from Saxon to French, and things changed rather dramatically. You also got changes in architecture, stone buildings and cathedrals and things soaring up. And then things calmed down again. And then King Henry decided he wanted to get a divorce. And we have the Protestant Reformation and specifically the dissolution of the monasteries, where the king's commissioners came in, dissolved the monasteries, and confiscated huge amounts of their wealth. And we think of sort of the shrines that are encrusted with jewels and everything, but another way that wealth manifested itself was in books. If this was a time when we're early in the era of printed books, but for the most part, the books in monasteries are still unique manuscripts that took 75, 80, 100, 200 sheep to produce the vellum, and then many, many thousands of man-hours to write out by hand. And so the books were quite valuable artifacts, and the commissioners would just take them. They would take them back to their own homes, they would take them and give them to the king, they would take them and put them in donate them to their college library at Oxford or Cambridge, and the libraries of the monasteries and of the cathedrals were severely depleted at that time. But our story survives. It makes it all the way to the English Civil War. Now, apologies to any Presbyterians in the audience, but this was not a good time to be an English cathedral. Many of them were directly threatened with intentional destruction, and while that didn't actually happen, they were used to house military garrisons, and a lot of the medieval woodwork was pulled down and used as firewood. In Winchester, they pulled down the mortuary chests that held the bones of the early English kings because they thought those would be convenient things to smash all the stained glass windows with. And to this day, they're now using DNA testing and other things to try to figure out which bones belong in which box. They're still not quite sure. Then things calmed down again, and then finally, of course, We had the Blitz in 1940 to 41. So those are that's some of the history that this manuscript moves through. And when one of you produces the Netflix series, every episode will begin with this little 3-minute historical scene. It'll be very cool. I see you nodding your heads. It's going to be great. I can give you the whole cast later on if you'd like. So one of the things you heard in that first scene was the young boy Edward talking about how these books were chained to the shelves. And this, again, is a historical reality. In the late medieval and early Renaissance period, as libraries were growing, and again, the books were very valuable, it occurred to librarians, we wouldn't call them librarians at the time, but it occurred to the powers that be, that one way to keep readers from just walking off with your books would be to chain them to the shelves. Now, not change the readers to the shelves, although presumably that would work as well. But and so they came up with this idea of chaining. And if you notice how these books are shelved, they're shelved spine inwards because the chain clips to the front edge of the book, and you didn't want the chains to get all tangled up. So sometimes you'll actually have the title of the book written on the foredge of the papers. These were some of the first libraries where books were shelved standing up. They previously had been shelved laying on top of each other, but then the chains would have been a hot mess. So I love the idea of taking various different historical realities and sort of colliding them and see what would happen. So I took this historical reality of the Blitz and the way in which the Blitz threatened the fabric of English cathedrals, and then this historical reality of chained libraries, and put those two things together in one scene to see what would happen. It's probably not going to shock you to find out later on in the book that the fact that the covers are missing from these manuscripts figures into the mystery in a certain way. So let's talk about our hero. His name is Arthur Prescott, of course, to be played in the film by Tom Hiddleston, I have no doubt. Got to have somebody who's as good looking as me, right? So Arthur is, we might call him a little old-fashioned, but he teaches at the local university, but he's deeply, deeply involved in the life of the church. He spends a lot of his time either in the cathedral or in the library at the cathedral. He goes to church services just about every day. He goes to evensong in the evenings, they do Compline at night, sometimes he goes to church 2 or 3 times a day. Nothing totally shocking about that, except for the fact that Arthur actually does not believe in God. And to me, this makes him somebody who might be worth finding out more about. I always like characters who have contradictions, because we all have contradictions, and generally it's what makes us interesting. It's not the expected thing about your friends that makes them stand out, it's the unexpected. Arthur is also very attuned to what we now call information technology. Arthur believes information technology reached its zenith, roughly 1450, and has been going pretty much steadily downhill ever since. And he really likes to spend his time around these ancient books and manuscripts in the cathedral library because they're sort of part of his soul. And computers and digital things are very much not a part of his soul. Arthur, as I said, is a lecturer at the local university. He would like to be a lecturer here at Oxford. It's where he believes he belongs. But he is a lecturer here at the University of Barchester. The University of Barchester, as Arthur writes in a recent survey of English universities, did not rate a mention honorable or otherwise. And believe it or not, although this is not a picture of the University of Barchester because it's fictional, they wouldn't let me take pictures of it. But this is an actual building from an actual British university. So it is possible for a British university to seem sort of dull and depressing. I'm going to read another short scene for you to introduce Arthur and his attitude towards his workplace, because I think it will help you understand why he spends so much time in a cathedral library surrounded by old books. This is the first scene in which we see Arthur, and he simply has arrived at work and encounters the chair of his department in the hallway. "Late again, Prescott," said Slopes. "And good morning to you, sir," said Arthur. "You do realize we had a meeting of the Curriculum Expansion Committee at 8. This may be a radical notion, sir, but do you think perhaps the Curriculum Expansion Committee ought to be populated by members of the faculty who actually favor curriculum expansion? Your personal tastes are entirely irrelevant to your committee work, Prescott. Now, if you had asked me to serve on the Curriculum Contraction Committee, I would have been here at 7. Arthur turned to walk down the hall, but heard Slopes' steps close behind. "Prescott, I cannot allow your continued absence from the work of this department to go unpunished. "Do you know, sir," said Arthur, turning on his heels and facing his tormentor, "that we teach a seminar in this department called Anagnoresis in the Existential Hogwarts, but we do not teach a seminar on Shakespeare? Prescott, that's William Shakespeare. He was a playwright. Not bad, actually. Nor do we teach seminars on Charles Dickens or Jane Austen. They wrote books, cracking good ones. They are all covered in the core module. And by the way, Prescott, the Hogwarts course is oversubscribed this term. I have no doubt, but that shouldn't mean this university must move with the times, Prescott, and so must you, or you will be left behind. Do I make myself clear?" "There was a time," said Arthur, "when universities led the culture rather than followed it." "There was also a time," barked Slopes, "when the Committee on Curriculum Expansion met, and that time was 8 o'clock. Now, if you miss one more meeting, I will have to report you to the Committee on Faculty Disciplinary Affairs." And no doubt they, thought Arthur as Slopes stomped off, will report my actions to the Committee on Flushing British Culture down the loo. No one, I'm sure, would ever guess that my father served on the faculty of a university for 40 years and would often let us know what he thought about his committee assignments. Now, there's also an example in here of what we call Easter eggs. You may have heard other writers talk about this. I mentioned that Barchester is a fictional town, but I did not invent it. It was invented by Anthony Trollope in the 1850s in a series of novels called the Barsetshire Chronicles. Barsetshire is the county in which Barchester is the county seat, if you will. And when I first submitted this book to my publisher, who is my editor, Catherine Court. She's the president at Penguin Books, but she's an English woman who's lived in New York for 35 years. And so she'd read Trollope, and she said, "I think you should put some more little Anthony Trollope, allusions in there." Now, if you haven't read Trollope, don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. It's just sort of character names and things like that. But I thought, good. Well, I'd read Barchester Towers, which is the most famous of these 6 novels. And, it's not really all that long. It's like a 500-page book, no big deal, right? So I thought, I'll just read the other 5. And so, I read The Warden, which is only 100. This is, by the way, LSD. This is how this works. You start out, you give them 185 pages, and they think, oh, no problem. I can do that. And the next thing you know, they're hooked. And so then Barchester Towers was $4.99. And then Dr. Thorne is just, a little bit longer. And Framley Parsonage is a little bit longer. And then The Small House at Allingham is 750 pages. And the last Chronicle of Barsetshire is 944 pages. So having read 3,644 pages I ended up changing about, 15 sentences in my book. But in this particular scene with Arthur's, with his boss, if you will, Mr. Slopes, he's named after the character Obadiah Slope, without an S, who is every bit as smarmy as he sounds, and who was played in the BBC miniseries by Severus Snape. So if you can imagine, sort of Snape in a 19th century clerical novel, that's Obadiah Slope. One of the other ways in which I used Trollope was I wanted to connect Arthur as deeply as possible to the cathedral and its precincts and its fabric and its surrounding buildings, not just the library, but I wanted his life to be really sort of soaked in the ancientness of the place. And two of the first of the Trollope novels in that series, The Warden and Barchester Towers, concern the endowment of a place called Hiram's Hospital. Now, Hiram's Hospital was what we would call an old folks' home. These were endowments that were made in the Middle Ages, usually by some sort of wealthy landowner who was trying to buy his way into heaven. And he would build some sort of nice little cottages, and he would endow them so that, elderly gentlemen generally, who were without any means of support, could go and retire there. And all that was really required of them was that they go to church, on a daily basis. And most of these, there's 1 or 2 of these foundations that still exist. There's one outside of Winchester, the Hospital of the Holy Cross, that still exists. And you can go to the church with the old men. They're really nice. But most of them over the centuries the foundations have run out of money, and they've dried up, and the cottages get turned into something else. And so I thought, well, why not turn them into the place where Arthur lives? These particular cottages here are very typical of what almshouses looked like, and this is kind of what I had in mind when I gave Arthur one of these ancient cottages. These are in a village called Chipping Norton, a market town called Chipping Norton, which is about 4 miles from where my wife and I live when we're in England. And so when we were working on the cover of the book, they sent me all this artwork, and they said, we want you to tell us what the architecture should look like. And all these little bits and pieces. You saw that massive cover. By the way, that was not actual size, the book that we showed earlier. If you want to buy a copy afterwards, we have some smaller copies. So I sent them this picture of the chippy almshouses, and then they sort of stylized that and worked it right into the cover. The arcading from the cloisters, they had it almost the way I wanted, and we were in England at the time, and I finally had to have my wife, I can't draw worth a darn, so I had to have her draw it out in pencil, exactly what we were thinking of, and then there it showed up on the cover. So the next character I want to talk about is this character, which is the library itself. I sort of think of this as a character. This book started out with the library. I had written The Bookman's Tale, which is partly set in an academic rare book library. I'd written First Impressions, a book about Jane Austen, which is partly set it's set in two different centuries, and in each century there's an English country house library that's key to the story. And I thought, cathedrals have libraries, and they have very ancient libraries. There's got to be some good stuff to write about there. So I just want to read you what it's like for Arthur when he goes into the library for the first time in this novel. It's not the first time he goes into it, but it's the first time we see him go in. He stood a moment with his eyes closed and inhaled the smell of antiquity. He could catch a hint of charred wood and a dash of dried mildew. The library smelled substantial. It smelled of both life and death. The air was stale and still, and Arthur felt the atmosphere of the place envelop him. He was home. Arthur walked softly to a case at the far end of the room, stood on tiptoe, and removed a plain-looking squat volume. It bore no markings, no indications to a casual observer that it was Arthur's favorite book in the library. He loved to take it down from its shelf, to caress its covers, to lose himself in the artwork of the frontispiece, and to read from its pages. The book was a 1634 edition of Malory's Morte, or as the title page called it, the most ancient and famous history of the renowned Prince Arthur, King of Britain. Arthur turned the soft, worn pages and inhaled the scent of history. The paper was pale brownish yellow, but the dark type was still as legible as it had been almost 400 years ago. He had work to do today, so he just read a short passage in Book 3 from a chapter titled, How Sir Galahad and his fellows were fed with the Sangreal, and how our Lord appeared to them, and of other matters. The Sangreal, the Holy Grail. Malory never wrote what the Holy Grail looked like, but to Arthur this meant the Grail could be whatever he needed it to be. Today it was an anchor, a solid link to a past that mattered, and that for Arthur was as alive as the present, perhaps more alive. At the edge of the text block was a bit of Latin marginalia written in Browning ink in a 17th century hand. It translated, "No better place for this book than Barchester." He ran his finger lightly across the inscription, wondering, as he always did when he looked at it, who had written those words, and more importantly, why. Some monk or priest or scholar had thought Barchester the perfect place for a book about King Arthur, and had chosen a page about the Holy Grail to note this. How he wished he could see into the past and know the reason. So there's a reason why I picked this particular book. This is the frontispiece, by the way. I love the fact that even though it's supposed to be set in the 800s or something, they're all wearing this great Jacobean armor because it's printed in 1634. But I chose this book for a reason, because one of the things I'm talking about is how important it is to preserve these stories and to preserve culture, and how easily they can be lost if we're not careful. And we think of the King Arthur stories and of Malory's Morte d'Arthur in particular as an indelible part of our history. I'm sure there are probably multiple different versions of them here in this library, and we came this close to never seeing them. It's only because of this book that we have them. So the earliest printed editions of Malory were printed by William Caxton, the first English printer, and they survive in a total of about 5 or 6 copies, the first 3 editions. Then they came along and they printed this one. This was translated into what they called modern English, what we would call sort of Shakespearean English. And this was printed in a lot more copies, and there's a lot of copies of this around. You could buy a copy of this book if you had $15,000 or $20,000 to spend on a book, but they're around. And then Arthur was not printed again for 182 years, which just sort of blows my mind. I mean, 2 entire centuries. And during this time, there were no movies about King Arthur, there were no Netflix series, no comic books. And it's only because the Romantics came along and got interested in medieval romance in the 19th century that these stories were revived. And if the Stansby hadn't been around, if it hadn't been sitting in libraries like the Barchester Cathedral Library and libraries in Oxford and Cambridge, they probably never would have found it. And we probably would not know anything about these stories. So I think it's a great lesson. Now, when I was working with the Stansby, I was at my local university library, and I was sitting at a computer screen looking at this really badly scanned version of it, but it was all I could find because it's a really rare book. And then we were getting ready to have my book launch, and the rare book librarian was going to bring over some medieval manuscripts for the book launch. And she called up and she said, "You want to bring like something early King Arthur? I've got one from 1634." I said, "I'm sorry, wait, the Stansby?" She said, "Yeah, I got the Stansby." It's like I was like the floor below you looking at a horrible computer screen, and the real one was sitting up in the rare book room. So I got to actually see the real thing, which was nice. So with a book that's set in a cathedral library, I had to do something which, I know we all have parts of our job that, like for Arthur, it's going to committee meetings. We all have parts of our job that are just not pleasant, but we have to do them anyhow. So I needed to go and look at some cathedral libraries. It's difficult, but somebody has to make these kind of sacrifices. And the best experience I had was here at Worcester Cathedral. This is about an hour drive from our little cottage in England. And at Worcester, a lot of these libraries, they're about the size of this stage. They're one big room, and there's a little velvet rope at one end, and you stand at the velvet rope and you look and you go, oh, there's some old books. But at Worcester, you could actually take a tour. And my wife and I, we were the only two people signed up. We took a tour of this beautiful space with Deirdre McEwen, who really and truly did have eyes that looked like a Disney princess. And Deirdre showed us, she would take these 800-year-old books off of the shelf and just like flip through them and go, look at this is cool, look at this. And she showed us graffiti in the margins of medieval manuscripts. She showed us a Saxon book, Gospel of John, that's still in its original binding. And this is an 1,100-year-old book, still in its original binding. In case you think that digitization is the way to preserve knowledge, this is the way to preserve knowledge. And there's so much from that experience that made its way into the book. Not only the specific things that she told us, but also just the feeling of the place. I have a really strong affinity between place and story. If you've read, I think, First Impressions, for instance, you probably get a sense of that. I didn't spend a lot of time in Jane Austen's hometown, but I went there and I looked around. There's not much to see, but you soak up the atmosphere of the place. You feel the landscape in your bones. And that was the case of being in the library here. So Arthur spends his time in the library trying to figure out things about the mystery of the Holy Grail, and maybe it's connected to Barchester. He suffers through his work at the university, and his life just moves along on a fairly steady keel until someone else shows up in the book. I think of her as the co-protagonist. She doesn't show up until page 43, I discovered the other day, but once she gets there, it's a whirlwind. And I don't really want to tell you much about her. I just want to read you the first scene in which she appears, because I think it will give you a sense of Bethany. The first time he saw her, he mistook her for a statue. The dean had mentioned the idea of a sculpture show in the chapter house, and when Arthur noticed the door standing open, he glanced in and saw a figure, silhouetted in the afternoon light that streamed down from above. Not the Virgin Mary, he thought, but perhaps Helen, the mother of Constantine and discoverer of the true cross. Her face was raised to the light, and her eyes seemed fixed on the empty stone panel above the bishop's seat. And then she moved. Arthur felt he should look away, that he intruded on some moment of intimacy, but something about the sun gleaming in her loose blonde hair and the puzzled expression on her face as she consulted the worn booklet in her hand held him entranced. I don't suppose you know where the painting is, she said calmly, as if she were continuing a conversation already begun, rather than turning to confront a man staring at her from the doorway. The painting, said Arthur, stepping from the shadows of the cloister and into the light of the chapter house. The portrait of Bishop Gladwyn and the Holy Grail. Arthur felt the hairs on the back of his neck bristle. How could this stranger know about Gladwyn's portrait? It's not the Holy Grail, he said tersely. So you do know the painting. Church Girl 42 posted a picture of it on Instagram, but the only reason I found it is because I don't just follow the hashtag Holy Grail, but I also follow a bunch of others, and she tagged it with hashtag Chalice, but she didn't say where it was except Barchester. So I went to the Cathedral website to order a guidebook, but apparently they don't have one. I even emailed, and they said the guy who's writing it keeps missing deadlines, so I got this one on eBay, but it's from the 1890s, so I guess it's a little out of date, but it says that John Collier's portrait of Bishop Gladwyn is supposed to hang in the chapter house, and this is the chapter house, right? This speech left Arthur feeling as breathless as he imagined she must be after such a torrent of words. I think I understood about a third of what you just said Arthur. I just wondered if you knew what happened to Bishop Gladwyn's portrait. It's moved, he said at last. It was moved in 1905. Excellent. Someone who actually knows what I'm talking about, she said, striding forward and extending her hand. I'm Bethany Davis. I'm here to digitize the manuscripts in the library. You're what? Here for the manuscripts in the library, I'm going to digitize them. That sounds perfectly dreadful, said Arthur. What does it mean? Oh, you must be Mr. Prescott. Gwen said that would be your reaction. You're exactly who I need to talk to. Whom? I beg your pardon, said Bethany. I am to whom you need to talk. You're just like Gwen said you would be. I knew I was going to like you. How about some tea? Or if it's too early for tea, then lunch. Unless it's too late for lunch, what do you do then? The pub? I don't really drink, but they have Diet Coke at the pub, right? Come on, drinks are on me. Okay, so catch your breath. I always have to catch my breath after I'm reading Bethany. That's Bethany, and there's something in that scene that if I had done it on purpose would have been pretty brilliant, but I'm gonna let you in on a secret here, and I don't know, you've had other authors come to talk to you, I guess. I don't know if any of them have told you this. If not, don't tell them that I told you. But the fact of the matter is, we're not as smart as you think we are. And I'm gonna go a step farther and say, actually, we're not even as smart as we think we are. I'm getting a little bit better because apparently there's something in the opening passage of The Bookman's Tale that's equally brilliant that I didn't even notice until a reader pointed it out to me after the book was published. And this thing I actually saw when it was in page proofs. I went, oh, that's really clever. I should have done that on purpose. But it's simply this. When at the beginning of the book, Arthur really sees the world almost as a museum. He sees the world as a place in which to store old paintings, old books, old manuscripts, old architecture, old music, old liturgies. And it's Bethany who comes into his world and shows him that the world is a living place. And so for him to have first seen her and thought that she was a statue, and then have her move and show that she is alive, is a pretty good encapsulation of his character arc, which was totally accidental. So I cannot claim, believe me, if I had done it on purpose, I would totally claim to have done it on purpose. So Bishop Gladwyn and his portrait, as you might have noticed, were fictional. But the painter who painted his portrait is not fictional, and that is a guy named John Collier. And I chose him for several reasons. First of all, he did paint some Arthurian paintings. This is a picture of Guinevere that he painted. I also really wanted to sort of reference the Pre-Raphaelites, and I think his work has a really strong Pre-Raphaelite feel to it, even though he's a little bit later. But they were fascinated by the Holy Grail. You saw Rossetti's painting of the Grail a few minutes ago. And but I also didn't want to use Rossetti or Holman Hunt or Burne-Jones or sort of the better-known Pre-Raphaelite painters, because to me it's sort of more fun to introduce you to real people who maybe you haven't heard of, and then you go to Wikipedia and you go, oh my gosh, it's a real person. Now I will say I've had people, like with First Impressions, I've had people email me and go, how come there's no Wikipedia entry for Richard Mansfield? I'm like, because he's a fictional character, would be what. But so those would all have been good reasons to have chosen John Collier, this guy right here, to be the painter of this fictional portrait. But there was a much better reason. Now, the portrait, of course, becomes one of the clues that Arthur is following. That's why he's so disturbed about the fact that Bethany's looking for it. So in 1879, John Collier married a woman named Marion Huxley. Now, this would have been good enough because Marion Huxley's, you got to bear with me for just a minute. Marion Huxley's father was a botanist named Thomas Huxley, who was a disciple of Charles Darwin. And Thomas Huxley was one side of what was known as the Great Debate. It was the debate in the new Museum of Natural History in Oxford in 1860, in which Thomas Huxley argued the idea of evolution with Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxfordshire. And it was in this debate where Bishop Wilberforce famously said to Huxley, is it on your mother's side or your father's that you're descended from monkeys? And it was largely considered that this was the point at which Wilberforce lost the debate, because he sort of was ridiculing the scientific discoveries of Darwin. So I thought that would be good enough. I mean, to have a bishop's portrait being painted by a guy whose father-in-law had the most famous debate with a bishop since Henry VIII called the Pope up on the phone asking for a divorce would have been pretty good. But it got even better, because Marion passed away in 1887, and Collier decided he would marry her sister Ethel. There was only one problem with this. Not only did the church disallow such a marriage, it was actually illegal under English civil law for a widower to marry his dead wife's sister. And so they had to go to Norway to get married. Now, granted, there's advantages to doing this. I imagine they had like great gravlocks at the reception, but nonetheless, for the next 20 years, and they stayed married for the rest of their lives, but for the next 20 years, their marriage was considered illegal by the English government until the law was changed in 1907. So I was like, that's great, that's got to go in the book. And the main reason was not only because I thought it was a great, juicy story, but also because I really wanted to see old-fashioned, medieval, manuscript, analog, stuffy Arthur Prescott have to explain all of that to vibrant, young, blonde American Bethany Davis. So that's what happens. They do, in fact, go out to get a drink, and he has to tell her this whole story. They eventually get into a big argument about books versus digital media. And a lot of people have asked me about that scene. They say, well, whose side are you on? And my answer is, it was one of the easiest scenes in the book for me to write because I agree with both of them. I could never have written this book without the chance of, for instance, going to the Worcester Cathedral Library and holding actual medieval manuscripts in my hands. But I also never could have written this book without digital access to the English newspaper archive or the scanned manuscripts from the British Library and other things of that sort. So to me, I really see the two working side by side, and we ignore either one, I think, to our peril. So I want to read one more short piece, because I know you're thinking about the first question now. You're going back to that screen going, he didn't talk about Ladies' Home Journal. What's the deal with the Ladies' Home Journal? But this, again, just sort of shows how I like to take two apparently disparate things and smash them together. And the two things are, I spent a lot of time wandering around English cathedrals over the years, and I like to take pictures of all the obscure little corners. And this is a plaque from Winchester Cathedral that's rather dull and uninteresting, and it just tells the story of the altar screen behind the high altar and how some of the statues got smashed at the time of the Reformation. And when I say smashed, I mean literally broken on the floor, not. So that's the one item, and then the other item that I thought I would juxtapose with that is my Penguin paperback of Right Ho Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. These two things on the surface have very little in common. But Arthur is a book collector, among other things, and he's inherited his grandfather's collection of Wodehouse. And although Arthur maybe doesn't seem like the sort of person who would have a sense of humor, he really does. And he has expanded that collection to encompass all the British humorists from about Lewis Carroll up to about Tom Sharp. And so, as you might have guessed, when Bethany said, I've been trying to find a guidebook, but the guy who's supposed to write it keeps missing his deadlines, that's Arthur, who keeps missing the deadlines. And the reason is sort of key to the whole mystery, which is Arthur is a very logical and sequential sort of person. He wants to write this guidebook, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Well, chapter 1 is the story of this saint whose biography has gone missing with this missing manuscript. And so, unable to find the answers, the key to chapter 1, he's unable to write anything else. But eventually the dean, who's a good friend of his, comes to him and says, look, we've given you £500 advance, and you're either going to have to give it back to us or you're going to have to get on the stick and write this guidebook. And so he's up late at night in the cathedral library, and Bethany is sort of goading him on and saying, come on, you got to have something, right? Tell me, just read me something that you've written and we'll have a place to start with. And so he goes, well, I have this piece I wrote about the altar screen. And she says, okay, well, read that. And what he reads is almost verbatim off of this tablet. I'm a great plagiarizer. He reads, the great altar screen of this cathedral church was erected in the course of the 15th century, primarily under the aegis of Bishop Maywood. It contains sculptures of over 120 saints and martyrs, including such English saints as Alban, Paulinus, and Hilda. In the year 1538, at the hands of King Henry VIII's commissioners, it was grievously mutilated and despoiled of the figures which had adorned it. In succeeding ages, it was subjected to various tasteless alterations until its original beauty was almost entirely effaced. God, Arthur, who would read this? Someone interested in the cathedral? Someone with insomnia, maybe? I thought you were a fan of P.G. Wodehouse. Couldn't you put a little, I don't know, a little humor in the thing? You think I should write the cathedral guide in the style of P.G. Wodehouse? Perfect idea, Arthur. Couldn't have put it any better myself. Think of it as a writing exercise. A writing, only don't write it, just tell me. Very well, said Arthur, leaning back in his chair. How would Wodehouse describe the altar screen, he thought. How would Gussie Finknottle describe it? He closed his eyes and gave it a go. Sometime longer ago than I care to think, a certain bishop what's-his-name took into his head the idea that the wall behind the altar should be chock-a-block with his betters. And by Jove, the next thing you knew, the place was filled to the ceiling with blokes who had gotten themselves so deep into the mulligatawny with the whole religion thing that they ended up losing their heads or being roasted alive or other various ballygood ways of shuffling off the old mortal coil. The next thing you knew, the whole country was Reformation mad, and old King Henry, when not working his way through wives like Galahad Threepwood through dry martinis, had taken something of a dislike to saintly types. And so in 1538, his cronies depopulated the screen, leaving the dean, if not actually disgruntled, far from being gruntled. Now, the far from being gruntled is actually stolen directly from P.G. Wodehouse. I used to think that it was T.S. Eliot who said, mediocre artists borrow, great artists steal. And I read someplace that they think that T.S. Eliot actually stole that quote from somebody else, but I don't know from whom. So if anybody ever finds out, you know. So I promised to be sort of ADD, and I think I was pretty ADD. There's the altar screen, by the way, at Barchester Cathedral. So we talked about a lot of these things. So I'm going to take away the ones that we talked about and replace them with other things so that it's really easy for somebody to ask the first question. Now, you don't even have to come up with the screen and point. By the way, if you have a question about something that's not up there, you can ask that as the first question. But yes. Are you talking about on here? I'm not sure. I'm not sure where that would be. Yeah, I see me after. I'll pull it up on my computer because I can go through the slides quicker on the computer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, to me, a character is someone who changes over the course of a novel. I mean, a good character, an interesting character. That there's some sort of arc to it. And in this book, there is an arc to the library. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but the library is not unlike Arthur at the beginning. It's kind of dormant. It's not being used very much. It's sort of lost its purpose. And part of what happens in the course of the novel is the library itself kind of coming back to life for a variety of reasons. So that's what I mean when I say that I see it as a character, that it sort of has a character arc. Whereas the case with when I use a book as a character, it's more about sort of coming into conflict and being threatened. Although in this case, the library also is threatened by external forces as well. So it's tough to answer some of these questions without giving away the game, you know. And it's a fun game, so you know, I don't want to give too much of it away. Other questions? Yes. Tell all the people. What she said is, my books are all amazing. You should all buy them and read them. I think I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially the. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it's I think there's this assumption that all people who are interested in old books are all old curmudgeons, and I have a lot of friends who are book collectors, and they're some of the funniest people I know. And I don't know. I mean, I have a friend in England who certainly has his curmudgeonly side, but he collects Lewis Carroll, but he also collects different editions of Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat, which if you haven't read it, just go home and read it right now. It's so funny. It's very much in the Woodhouse vein. But yeah, we book collectors do have a sense of humor. We're not all, yeah.
I'm going to come up with the microphone so that, because people in the back
Okay,
can't hear.
yeah.
So where was right there?
Before there were books, there was oral storytelling.
Yeah.
And I actually have listened to your book, this new one, on Audible. And
Yeah.
I was wondering if you've heard it yourself and what you might think of that.
Yeah, so two reactions to that. One, I was out in the desert taking this tour today, and they were talking about what we know about the native peoples who lived here hundreds and even thousands of years ago. And what we know is what's passed down through oral storytelling. And it's a remarkable thing when you talk about what leads to cultural dominance. Having a written language gives you a history. It is much more. My understanding is that one of the only native peoples who had a written language when Europeans arrived on the North American continent were the Mayans, and then we thought that their books were all heretical, so we burned all of them. There's 4 or 5 Mayan books, like individual books that survive today. So it just shows you the importance of having a written language. I have listened to that audiobook. That was. With Bookman's Tale and with First Impressions, I got to sort of help pick out the person because they were being done in-house by Penguin Random House, and then they started sort of selling the rights off to other companies, and so I didn't have any input in that. I think as long as Bethany's not talking, he's great. But I don't know where he learned his American accent. It's a British author. And I'm not saying not to listen to the audiobook. It's a perfectly good way to, but I didn't envision Bethany as somebody whose father was one of the Three Stooges. And who every now and then slips back into having an English accent once in a while. But so it is a very bizarre experience to listen to your own books on Audible. But to me, having spent so much time as a playwright, I'm very attuned to the idea of performance interpretation and of the performer and even the listener being equal partners in the creative process. And so it's actually fun to listen to. There's a scene, I think the woman who does First Impressions is just great. And there's a scene in that book where there's an argument going on. And in my head when I was writing it, the characters were getting louder and louder and louder, and then the last word was sort of a shouted, angry thing. And this reader does the last word as almost a whisper. And I just got chills. I like, oh, what a brilliant choice. I never would have thought of that. Because it's not in the text. It doesn't say one way or the other. But I also think it's also important as a reader to know that if you're listening to an audiobook, there's now a third person in the creative process. That's not a bad thing, but it's just something to be aware of. That it's not just you and the writer creating something up in your head together. There's also a narrator that's becoming part of it. Yeah.
I spend a lot of time over the years going to literary luncheons with wonderful, I don't really need it, with wonderful authors. Well, but it's not on.
Yeah, it's on.
Can you? Gotcha. Sorry about that. Anyway, long story short, your presentation was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Incredibly enjoyable. But you're the first author to use graphics in his presentation. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, I don't know why more people don't do that. It's not that hard. And it helps me because I look up there and I go, oh yeah, I'm supposed to talk about that.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very involved and on the subject of LSD, organizations like that are so important. And I'm very involved in the literary arts organization in my own hometown. It's called Bookmarks. We do an annual book festival. We have author events year-round. We just opened a nonprofit independent bookstore because we didn't have a decent bookstore in our town. And it's amazing organization to be a part of. And right before Bookman's Tale came out, we do a movable feast event once a year where you have about 20 tables and authors have about 10 minutes to talk to each table, and then they move around, so you get to hear a lot of different authors talk about their books. And one of the authors that was coming was Melanie Benjamin, who's been very successful in recent years. But she had written a book about Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, and I was like, I got to get her to the house if she's going to be in town. So Melanie Benjamin and Erica Roebuck and Emily Collin came to my house for lunch. And Melanie got to go look at all kinds of cool Alice in Wonderland stuff. She had a good time. And they found out I had a novel coming out. And it was like I had these 3 older sisters who were full of wonderful advice. And one of the things they said was, they don't call them readings anymore. You can't just stand there and read. You got to give added value, you know. And I'm a theater major and a playwright, and as my wife would say, a ham. And so you took the trouble to come here. I should give you something that you can't get by just buying the book and taking it home and reading it. Yeah.
I said I'll buy the journal.
The Ladies' Home Journal.
Yes, the little Grail mystery.
So the Ladies' Home Journal, back when I was in the rare book business, I bought a house full of books one time, and out of one of these books tumbled this clipped article from the Ladies' Home Journal about this guy who had driven all the way across the south of England looking for the Holy Grail in the form of a cup called the Nantios cup. It's a wooden cup that lived for many centuries in a house in Wales called Nantios House. And some years later, I found that I still had one page of this article, and I thought, I want to go read the whole thing. And I went to my college library, and they had the bound volumes of Ladies' Home Journal, and the article was missing. Somebody had cut it out. So then it was a mystery. Then another 25 years go by, and I start working on this book, but now they've invented eBay. So for $4, I got my own. And by the way, not only can I recommend the article, but if you buy this Ladies' Home Journal on eBay for $4, you get the article about Amy Vanderbilt's facelift. Absolutely no extra charge. So, so basically, Bethany is also a Holy Grail, also passionately interested in the Holy Grail. And this article in Ladies' Home Journal is what got her interested, because her grandmother saved all these old magazines. So when she was a little girl, she would read all these old magazines, and she came across this article. So that's how I tied it back in. After the book came out, I got a message from a guy in Wales who said, and the Nantios Cup features in the book too. I got a message from a guy in Wales. He said, the Nantios Cup's on display at the National Library of Wales, in case you're interested. And so my wife and I drove over there last spring and went to see it. It was really cool. But when I started working on the book, the Nantios Cup had been stolen. And I thought, this is cool. So I worked it into the plot that it had been stolen. And I was driving into London to go see my British publishers, when the book was still in manuscript. And as I'm pulling into the parking lot, the hourly news comes on, and they go, Gloucestershire police have recovered the Nantios Cup. I'm like, no, I got to change the whole thing now. So I had to do a little rewrite. But that article followed me around for about 30 years. And then we finally got to go see the Nantios Cup. If you're ever in Wales, go to Aberystwyth, which has got to have the most beautiful National Library view in the world. You go out the front door of the National Library of Wales, and the sea is right out in front of you with this beautiful town down below you. And up at the top of the steps behind you is the Holy Grail? I don't know. So. There we go.